I just wanted to let you know we are a non-profit environmental organization. We're a very small organization with a huge job. We work to protect land and water. We provide advice to towns and municipalities on climate resilience, ecological restoration, and we provide educational programs for schools, families, and adults. Much of our work and almost all of our programs are grant supported, and others are supported by our members and donors, and we remain ever grateful for them for their support and generosity. So for those of you who are members, I thank you. For those who might like to learn more about us, please visit our website, Nashua River Watershed .org. So now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Ben Goldfarb. Ben is an environmental journalist whose work has appeared in National Geographic, The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, The New Yorker, and many other publications, and has several times been anthologized in Best American Science and Nature Writing. His most recent book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, was named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times and received the Rachel Carson Award for Excellence in Environmental Writing and the Banff Book Competition's Grand Prize. His previous book, Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, won the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And so here's Ben with his talk, Damn It, Partnering with Beavers to Save the Planet.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that introduction, Gaynor. Thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I live in Colorado, but I'm a former Massachusetts resident and always really excited to address audiences from New England in particular. So thanks again for being here. So this evening I'm going to talk about, as the title says, working with beavers, partnering with beavers to achieve various ecological restoration goals. But before we get into what it means to work with a beaver, I think it's important to establish a few basic beaver facts about what these critters are and how they make their living. Because, you know, we think about them sometimes in the beaver movement as ecological tools in a sense, but they're also just incredible evolutionary marvels in their own right. So beavers, of course, are rodents, as I'm sure all of you know. They're North America's largest rodent. A typical adult beaver is 40 to 50 pounds or so, so they're quite a bit heftier than most people realize. Typically, you just see that head cruising along with the bulk of their body concealed underwater like an iceberg. And they're semi-aquatic rodents, which means they really do spend all of their lives essentially in and around water. And they've got a number of incredible adaptations for this unique semi-aquatic niche they fill. They've got one of the thickest furs in the animal kingdom, one of the thickest pelts, which was their downfall, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they've got as many individual hairs on a postage stamp size patch of skin as we have on our entire heads. So remarkably dense fur. They've got these wonderful webbed duck-like hind feet. They're very powerful, agile swimmers. They can hold their breath for up to 15 minutes, so they're really champion breath holders. They've got a second set of eyelids, transparent eyelids called nictitating membranes, which function as goggles underwater. As well as a second set of lips, fur-lined lips, which they can close behind their front teeth, which sort of acts like a valve, so they can chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. A pretty cool beaver feature. And then what's a beaver's most iconic, identifiable trait? What makes a beaver a beaver? It's that tail, right? And that tail serves all kinds of different functions. It's a rudder while they swim. It's a kickstand out on land. It's a fat storage device. They actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. And it's an alarm system. If you've spent much time around wetlands, you've surely heard the smack of a beaver's tail hitting the water, which they do to warn other beavers about the potential presence of predators. And the other fabulous beaver feature worth highlighting are those teeth. The teeth, as you can see, the top and bottom incisors are basically self-sharpening, so they file each other down. And they're orange. And the reason for that is that they're actually structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their foods. They've got these wonderful iron teeth, which really comes in handy when you spend your whole life cutting down trees, right? So beavers eat the cambium, that's the inner bark, the sugary layer that does the growing of trees. They have a few species of tree that they really prefer. Anything in the poplar family, cottonwood, birch, aspen. Willow is a classic beaver food. They do really tend to avoid conifers. They've got a very strong preference for deciduous trees. And they also eat lots of green herbaceous vegetation as well. Cattails, water lilies. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. They are entirely herbivorous. They don't eat fish at all. I think a common misconception. But they're what scientists call choosy generalists. They've got a few species of tree and plant that they really prefer, but they'll eat just about anything vegetative. So of course, in addition to felling the trees to eat that cambium, the inner bark. They're also using wood as construction material. And there are a couple of basic types of beaver structure that you're probably familiar with. The first is the beaver lodge. That's the kind of the fundamental beaver housing unit. There underwater tunnels that lead up into the lodge and kind of an elevated nesting chamber in the lodge. That's where the colony or the family lives. That's typically 2 to as many as 8 or so beavers. Generally, you've got the male and female monogamous mating pair who mate for life. The kits, the baby beavers, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. So at times you've got 3-year classes of siblings all cohabitating in the lodge. And then it's those 2-year-olds who will disperse out looking for their own territories, like they're going off to beaver college. Often you see these kind of big freestanding island lodges in the middle of the pond. Probably more common are bank-attached lodges like this one. And then occasionally, or maybe even frequently, they'll just tunnel into the bank, burrow in there, put a bunch of sticks on top as a ventilation shaft, basically, and live pretty inconspicuously in the stream bank. So just because you don't see a big freestanding volcanic island like that one doesn't mean that they're not tucked away in the bank, living their lives. And that, by the way, that's my dog named Kit, which is what you call a baby beaver. So I've truly got a one-track mind. So that's the lodge. And then the other beaver structure that, again, I'm sure you've all seen at some point, is the beaver dam, right? So why do beavers do this? What is the point of this most famous of beaver behaviors? Basically a beaver out on land is, as one biologist put it to me, a fat, slow, smelly package of meat, right? And they get eaten by bears and cougars and wolves and all kinds of large carnivores. So by building that dam, they expand and deepen the stream into this big pond, and they're essentially engineering their own shelter, their own safety, instead of having to walk 100 yards overland to that good-looking cottonwood tree. They can swim up to it instead, cut it down, float it back to the lodge, all minimizing their time out of the water. So that dam is really functioning as a kind of a security device. Important to note that if they're living in deep water, a big main stem river or a lake, they already have plenty of water and they don't have to build a dam, right? So just because, again, you don't see a beaver dam doesn't mean that there aren't beavers in the area. They actually, people always say that they're, the busiest animals, right? But they're actually very efficient and they'll only build a dam on those smaller, higher streams and wetlands where they really need that dam and pond to have sufficient water depth to be safe and comfortable. Beaver dams come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. Some colonies are building up to, a dozen or 15 dams. One big primary dam and then a number of smaller secondary dams. I just love, this is one near my home in Colorado. I just love that perfect radial arc. And you actually see a lot of rock in that dam, and they actually carry those rocks in their front paws and kind of waddle along on their hind legs, which is a very cute thing to see. When left to their own devices in the right circumstances, they can do some pretty spectacular stuff. Here's a dam in northern Minnesota that's about 600 feet long and 15 feet high or so. And obviously the work of many generations of beavers all adding their stick to the pile. So, this is not maybe a typical dam in its grandeur, but this is the sort of thing that they are able to do in a national park setting like this one, where they're not being trapped out. I'm always really impressed by their hydrological savvy. I feel like if you took an engineer from the Army Corps and put her on a stream and said, okay, build a dam that minimizes labor and maximizes the total impoundment, she would put the dam exactly where the beavers do, right? So here's a 300-acre beaver pond created by one relatively small dam at a narrow constriction point where a stream flows through a canyon. A pretty brilliant piece of engineering. And we talk a lot about beavers as builders, of course, and rightfully so. But that's not their only trick. They're also prolific diggers. They excavate these amazing networks of canals that lead up into the forest. And again, that's another really important way that they move water around the landscape. And the function of those canals is basically they're feeding canals. They can swim up those canals, cut the tree down, float it back, out that canal back to the main pond. Again, all minimizing their time out of the water, and that's again a really important way that they're moving water around the landscape. And you often see tadpoles and juvenile fish in these little slow water canals that beavers create. And this is a canal system in Northampton. So beavers are doing all of this stuff, right? They're building dams, they're creating ponds, they're digging canals, they're moving water around the landscape, and they're doing all of that, to maximize their own security and habitat. But in the process, they're creating habitat for lots of other creatures as well, right? I'm sure many of you are birders. Where do you go birding? Around a wetland. Animals are attracted to water, especially in the American West where I live, where wetlands cover about 2% of land area and support around 80% of biodiversity. So any animal that's capable of creating and expanding and maintaining wetlands is disproportionately important to the environment. Beavers are what scientists call a keystone species. And in architecture, the keystone is the top block in a stone arch. And if you pull that block out, the whole arch crumbles, and beavers are likewise supporting a lot of weight in ecosystems. A few classic beaver beneficiaries, of course, are waterfowl, wading birds. This is a great blue heron rookery in a beaver pond, as well as songbirds, passerines, flycatchers, warblers. You always see those guys, kind of hanging out in those coppiced willows that beavers create, and they're, picking off those emergent aquatic insects coming out of the pond and nesting in those willows and so on. So again, where do you bird in a wetland? Other aquatic or semi-aquatic mammals: otter, mink, muskrat, moose. Here's a moose in a beaver pond in Utah, all very closely associated with beaver infrastructure. Amphibians, in New England, you'd see lots of leopard frogs and wood frogs and spotted salamanders and newts in and around beaver ponds. Here in Colorado, our kind of iconic endangered amphibian is the boreal toad, and 90% of boreal toad breeding occurs in beaver ponds. They're basically beaver pond obligates. So those are all, kind of classic examples: birds, amphibians. Those are all what you find in the beaver textbooks, right? But one of the great things about going to a beaver complex, a beaver pond and wetland, is that you can't not see something weird or interesting or surprising or cool, right? These animals just create all of these amazing biological connections. So here's an old beaver lodge in Minnesota. This is a place where the beavers left the area, the pond drained, the lodge was left high and dry. And in this case, a pack of wolves actually moved into the beaver lodge and raised their pups in that lodge. So that's beavers creating habitat for their direct predators, right? Pretty amazing. Another neat example, a couple of years ago, I was in Utah hanging out in some beaver ponds with a friend, and we saw a sandhill crane walking atop the crest of one of those beaver dams. And I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. I've never seen a sandhill crane in a beaver pond before. So I took a picture, and then later I looked more closely at the crane's feet, and it turned out she had built a nest and laid a clutch of eggs in that on atop that beaver dam, which was basically acting like this little island, little predator-proof island in the middle of that pond. So again, just these ecosystems that beavers create are just incredibly bountiful and full of amazing ecological connections, and they're just so much fun to be around. And then, probably the most important beaver beneficiary, at least one of the reasons that beavers are so hot right now in many places, are salmonids, trout and salmon. This is a juvenile steelhead, so a rainbow trout that, goes to the ocean like a salmon. Brook trout in New England are very closely associated with beaver ponds. And the reason for that is that, if you're a juvenile trout or salmon, you don't want to live in the big, free-flowing, fast-moving main stem river, right? You're just going to get blown downstream and, probably eaten by a kingfisher. What you want is that slow water refuge habitat. You want a deep pond or a side channel or a meander or an eddy. You want that kind of complexity, which is exactly what beavers create. And there are a million studies linking beavers to fish production. Of course, the objection that you hear, from anglers and even sometimes fish biologists is, wait a second, we're trying to take dams out of rivers right now, right? And I know you're very familiar with that in Massachusetts. We're not trying to put more obstacles to fish into rivers. But of course, a beaver dam is nothing like a giant human-built concrete dam, right? And fish have all kinds of ways of getting around, those beaver dams. Lots of fish are migrating during periods of high flow when there's water going over the top of beaver dams or around them. I've seen fish, wriggling through the woody lattice of the dam itself. This is sort of anecdote rather than data, but here's a stream outside of Seattle that I visited a couple of years ago. And you can see in the top right corner, there's the beaver dam. Here's the beaver pond. And here are the two freshly excavated coho salmon redds or nests. So at least two fish had no problem whatsoever, surmounting that obstacle. And in fact, the evolutionary connection between beavers and fish, these organisms that have shared the landscape for at least 8 million years, is so deep that it inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which is "Beavers taught salmon to jump." So we've been talking about, birds and fish and moose, but what do beavers do that we humans might care about? Why do we want more, more beavers on the landscape? And, it's kind of a selfish position to take, but, certainly it's an important argument to be able to make on their behalf, right? That these are important ecosystem engineers who are shaping the landscape in ways that we appreciate. And probably the most important one here in the West, where I live, is they're great drought mitigators, right? We're totally dependent on our snowpack for our water. The snow falls in the winter, it gradually melts, and that melt is what keeps water in our streams all summer long. The problem is that with climate change, of course, more of that precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow, and it's getting hotter and drier here. And as some of you probably know, while you guys were having one of your snowiest winters in memory, Colorado is having its worst snow winter in recorded history, right? So we're really desperate here right now, and in the context of that, hey, here is this wonderful rodent capable of building thousands of little reservoirs for us up in the high country, keeping that water on the landscape, right? So this little stream, this is the headwaters of the Roaring Fork River here in Colorado. This is at about 12,000 feet of elevation, so beavers get way the heck up there. The Roaring Fork is an important tributary to the Colorado River. I'm sure a lot of you have read about the current Colorado River crisis, a river that's very rapidly running out of water, and the states can't agree on how to allocate it. So in the face of that, beavers are one solution to addressing some of those water problems, right? So that stream is kind of, meandering along. It's this, sinuous sine wave. And then it hits all of these linear features, these beaver dams, which create these beaver ponds. And that water is just up there and that headwater very gradually trickling out through those dams and just making sure there's still water in the streams all summer long. So that ability to store water and mitigate drought and help us adapt to climate change, that's a really important thing that beavers do. I should note too that, when you look at a beaver pond, there's all of that visible surface water that you see, but what you don't see is all of the water being forced into the ground, recharging aquifers, hydrating soils. There's 5 to 10 times as much groundwater being stored at beaver sites as surface water. Of course, in New England, you have the opposite problem, right? You've got, more intense precipitation, more flooding, drought here in the West, flooding in New England. But, there too, beavers have an important role to play. And that's a little bit counterintuitive to people. I think we think about beavers as animals who cause flooding, rather than mediate it. But, you get a big rainstorm, all of that rain is racing down river. It's tearing out trees and damaging people's property. And then it hits that series of beaver dams and ponds and it just slows down, right? The water's captured in the ponds. It spreads out laterally onto the floodplain. It sinks into the ground. There have been studies showing that a single family of beavers with their dams and ponds can capture 30% of the big runoff events on certain streams. So these are, fantastic flood fighters. This is a beaver pond in Scotland. Of course, a very rainy place. Gaynor and I were talking just a few minutes ago about Eurasian beaver reintroduction, and in England and Scotland and Wales, places that are getting wetter with climate change, they're reintroducing beavers in part as a flood mitigation technique. So I think that's kind of magical to contemplate, right? We've got these two problems, drought in the West, flooding in the East, both exacerbated by climate change, seemingly polar opposite problems. And yet beavers can help us tackle both of them by just stabilizing the flows coming down our streams. Beavers are fabulous irrigators, right? Again, they're spreading water out, the water's soaking into the ground. What does it do? It grows plants. And so, it's a big deal for guys like this. This is a rancher in Nevada who I met named James Rogers, who's encouraged the return of beavers to his ranch. Because as he pointed out, beavers are basically increasing the forage production on his ranch by about tenfold through their irrigation prowess. So, now there's this wonderful movement of pro-beaver ranchers all over the American West, especially. These are guys whose dads shot beavers and whose dad's dad shot beavers, and now they're embracing them because they see what these animals can do, again, from an irrigation perspective. Beavers are wonderful pollution filterers, right? That stream is racing along. It's carrying nitrates and phosphates and heavy metals and pesticides and herbicides, all of this crap, and then that stream hits that beaver dam and pond. It slows down. Those pollutants settle out. The nitrates get denitrified by bacteria, and beavers are thus kind of acting as like these watershed scale kidneys, filtering out those pollutants and capturing a lot of carbon as well. A lot of that stuff that's settling out is organic matter, very carbon rich. So beavers are actually sequestering carbon in their ponds. They're helping us both adapt to climate change and mitigate climate change. Kind of cool. And then, the final really hugely important beaver benefit that I'll highlight for now, especially here in the West, is they're great firefighters, right? Water doesn't burn. Beavers spread water out. They turn dry brown plants, that are flammable, green and lush, and thus fireproof. So here's an example of that. This is The Sharps Fire in Idaho burned about 100,000 acres a few years ago. And, you can just see from this picture, the last green, wet, blue, lush place on the landscape is that beaver-influenced valley bottom. In fact, Emily Fairfax, who's the scientist who has done a lot of the beaver fire research, she's even proposed that the Forest Service change its mascot from Smokey Bear to Smokey Beaver. I think that's a good idea. So, how many beavers live in North America today? How abundant is this animal? And we don't really know. Most states don't rigorously monitor their beaver populations, but the best guess is that we've got 10 to 15 million beavers in North America. So they're doing okay, right? They're not an endangered species. They're not at risk of extinction anytime soon. But then you start to wonder, wait a second, how many beavers used to be here? How many beavers did live on this continent at the time of European arrival? And there again, we don't really know. But the best guess is that there were several hundred million beavers on the landscape. I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. Perhaps 200 million or so beaver ponds, which a little bit of back of the envelope math tells you would have collectively impounded something like 230,000 square miles of total land, which is the size of Arizona and Nevada put together. That's how much land was potentially underwater thanks to beavers. And I think it's important to note that this notion that beavers were good and important and are keystone species, that's not a unique one to Western science. Obviously, native tribes all over North America have very old relationships with beavers. The Blackfeet, for example, in Montana, revered beavers, or do revere beavers, consider them sacred, because they recognize that, hey, in these arid Western landscapes, especially, these animals are creating these ecological oases, as the historian Rosalind Lapierre put it. These watering holes for elk and bison and other important game animals. Likewise, in the Northeast, many tribes knew and managed beavers to basically create these wet meadows, around the margins of beaver ponds, and those wet meadows are really good forage for deer and moose and other important food species. So again, the notion that we want beavers around is something that Western science, I think, is only recently catching on to, or at least recently compared to to native understandings of how important these animals are. So one of the things that I tried to do, working on this book, was just piece together what a fully beavered landscape looked like and what it felt like and what it sounded like. What was North America like when there were several hundred million beavers, putting ponds and wetlands everywhere. And I think there's no question that it was once a much greener, wetter, bluer, lusher place than it is today. There are accounts of explorers and trappers and railroad surveyors, crossing places like Wyoming, which is, basically desert today, and finding these lush marshes full of waterfowl that beavers had created. Lewis and Clark talk about seeing beaver dams and ponds in every single tributary, of the Missouri River that they encountered, during the course of the Corps of Discovery. So that was in 1805 that, Lewis and Clark described seeing beavers everywhere. In 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, of course, the naturalist and painter, traveled the same landscape looking for beavers to paint. And he couldn't find a single beaver in the entirety of the Missouri River, where they'd been ubiquitous just 38 years earlier. So what happened to all of those beavers? What did they turn into? Well, of course, they turned into hats, right? I think we hear the phrase beaver hat and think of like a big fluffy Davy Crockett type of thing. But in fact, beaver hats were these elegant Victorian top hats that were made from the felted under fur of beavers. And, these were all the rage in Europe for a couple hundred years. And so the fur trade, the beaver trade really begins in New England in the early 1600s, proceeds rapidly west and south across the continent, with fur trappers and traders basically annihilating beavers in every single river, lake, stream, and pond they encounter. And by the middle of the 19th century, you would have been pretty hard pressed to find a beaver anywhere in the United States, certainly in the lower 48. I think it's hard to overstate, the historic role that the fur trade played in North America. Beaver furs, along with timber and cod and gold, were really the most important economic resource the colonists found in North America, and basically every historic event prior to the Civil War, from the Louisiana Purchase to the War of 1812 to the American Revolution, has some kind of beaver connection. This is a coin minted by the Oregon Territory, which historically covered the entirety of the Northwest, all the way to Wyoming, about 20% of the country. And the value of one beaver coin was fixed to the value of one beaver pelt. So the entire currency of a fifth of the United States at one point operated on the pelt standard. I think that's an amazing indication of how historically significant the fur trade was. Of course, in addition to being this hugely significant historic event, the fur trade was also a profound ecological, even geological event, right? What happens when you kill several hundred million beavers? Well, all of those beaver dams break down, all of those ponds drain, streams dry up, and wetlands disappear, and creeks erode, and so on. And I think that when we think about the early environmental disasters that kind of afflicted North America. We think about the deforestation of New England or the busting of the sod in the Midwest, but the beaver trade was in some ways the original sin, and kind of the aquatic dust bowl. I mean, what did it mean for moose or wood ducks or brook trout, to lose hundreds of millions of beaver ponds? It was, unquestionably an ecological disaster. So right around 1900 or so, the beaver population in North America has reached its nadir. We've gone from several hundred million beavers to perhaps 100,000 or so, pretty much all up in Canada. Again, these animals are functionally extinct in the lower 48. But right around then, we kind of start to wise up. Enos Mills, who's a great naturalist and a friend of John Muir's, wrote a wonderful book called In Beaver World in 1913, where he basically, made the revolutionary claim that live beavers were more valuable than dead ones. And all over the country, various states start to restrict trapping and to reintroduce beavers. Interestingly, Massachusetts, their beavers actually, your beavers actually come from New York. I'm sorry to say to all of the Red Sox fans out there, but the state of New York actually reintroduced beavers to the Adirondacks in the early 1900s, which they got from Canada, and that became essentially the source population for just natural beaver dispersal throughout New England. So you can thank or blame New York. Of course, the most famous beaver reintroduction occurred in Idaho in 1948. Some of you, probably know this story. But let's see, let's fast forward to the good stuff. There we go. So 1948, Idaho is trying to reintroduce beavers into what is today the Frank Church Wilderness area. At first, they try moving the beavers on horseback. The horses don't really like that, as you can imagine. So then they have this bright idea of putting them into crates and dropping them out of airplanes. Right? It's 1948. It's just post World War II. They've got all of these surplus parachutes on hand, and they have the brilliant idea of chucking beavers out of planes. So they the state of Idaho airdropped 76 beavers in 1948. 75 of the beavers survived. One has unfortunately escaped from the crate in midair and fell to his death. Very sad. But the next year, when they flew back over that area, they saw new dams and ponds and all the places where they'd airdropped beavers. So nobody's doing this anymore, but that was how it was done in the 40s. So, all throughout the 20th century, beavers are starting to recover from the fur trade, right? They're being reintroduced, they're being protected in some cases, their populations are increasing, and they're recolonizing their former territories. The only problem is that in their absence, we've colonized those same places, right? It turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat is basically one and the same. We both like broad, fertile floodplains and low gradient stream corridors. That's where we build our roads and railroads and power lines and towns and farms, and that's where beavers put their ponds and wetlands. And I'd argue that we're the nuisance species more than they are. But there's no question that they can be hard animals to coexist with in a lot of respects, right? So here's just one quick example of that. Here's a little cabin that I stumbled upon in New Mexico a few years ago. You can see that beavers have kind of flooded the whole property, but I just like this picture. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but basically the beavers begin their dam in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. They dam up to the base of the cabin, then they incorporate the cabin into the dam, and then they keep going on the right-hand side of the screen, right? So you kind of have to admire the ingenuity there. Uh, I know, you guys do lots of culvert work, and of course, culverts are probably the most common source of beaver conflict, right? If you're a beaver, the roadbed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert is the leak in the dam, and beavers plug leaks. That's what they do. Water rises, road washes out. Big, dangerous, expensive headache to deal with. So that's probably the most common form of beaver conflict, but they get into all kinds of creative mischief. Here's a beaver who broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was apprehended while browsing the Christmas tree aisle, which feels like a parable for something. And I'll just note that just a couple of months ago, The Onion actually had a piece about more Americans moving away from urban areas for rural life, where they have escalating feud with beaver. So when your cause makes The Onion, you've really made it, right? But that headline really speaks truth, because in a lot of ways the whole country is locked in this escalating feud with beavers. Every year, the federal government, the Department of Agriculture, kills around 25,000 beavers. Private nuisance trappers kill certainly tens and probably hundreds of thousands more. We don't really know. And of course, that makes a certain intuitive sense, right? The beaver's causing a problem. Get the beaver out of there. The issue with that kind of reflexive, lethal approach to beaver management is a fewfold. I mean, first, of course, when you eliminate the beavers, you're also eliminating that great pond and wetland habitat that we know is so important. But also, all you're doing is putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as that culvert is there beckoning to them, they're always going to come back. And so all of these communities, including, certainly many in New England, are trapped in this, kind of cycle of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization that I would argue is, both ecologically nonsensical, inhumane, and also, really not solving the infrastructural problem. So one option to for dealing with beaver conflicts is relocation. We do a lot of that here in Colorado. A lot of the western states do this. But to me that's not really the preferred option. It's actually prohibited in most New England states. It's because a lot of the landscape, a lot of the available habitat is already taken, and they don't want to they don't want to spread disease. There are other kind of factors there. Of course, lots of the beavers you move, don't stay put, and they end up on somebody else's private land, or they die in transit. That happens too sometimes. So, to me, really the best solution or set of strategies for dealing with these animals is just to learn to live with them, to learn to non-lethally solve some of the conflicts that they create, to leave the beavers on site and protect the infrastructure you're trying to protect without killing them, right? So here's one really neat example of that. This is so lots of beavers get killed for cutting down trees, right? Ornamental trees or fruit trees or what have you, and I just don't ever think that a beaver should be killed for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve. So here's a neat example of creative solution finding. This is actually in the town that I live in Colorado, Salida. The town by this pond had all of these beautiful old cottonwood trees they wanted to protect, which they fenced off with some heavy gauge wire fencing. Okay, that's fine. And so because they were deprived of the cottonwood, beavers took down the non-native Siberian elm trees. So that's actually invasive vegetation management using the beaver as your agent. I think that's the kind of cool, creative problem solving we can do when we don't take a reflexively lethal approach. Flooding is a more difficult problem to solve at times, but there too we've got great options, right? This guy is Skip Lyle, inventor of the beaver deceiver, which is kind of a specific product, but that's a term that you just hear thrown around a lot for any kind of beaver mitigation device these days. And the Skip's devices, along with other products out there, all kind of work on the same principle. The idea is that you run a pipe, through a beaver dam or into a road culvert to just keep that water flowing out of the pond, drop the level of the pond. Those cages are there to basically prevent the beavers from plugging up the pipe ends because they will do that. And you can actually see in this picture, you can see the water line on the trees right behind Skip there. So you can see how far the pond is dropped. But, the goal is to basically retain some ponds so that the beavers are kind of satisfied. They can stay where they are. But, the infrastructure is protected, right? You don't have to, swim across your driveway anymore because you've dropped the level of the water far enough. And I'll just add, quickly. Well, yeah, we'll move on. So, here's another example of beaver mitigation. This is a great culvert protection fence built by Mike Callahan, who's a Massachusetts resident and the founder of the Beaver Institute, a fabulous nonprofit devoted to solving beaver problems. Mike has built these sorts of culvert protection devices all over New England, and they're extremely effective. You basically check them a couple times a year to clear the debris away, as Mike is doing here, and they're again highly effective. Mike has found that these pond leveling devices and these culvert protection fences are effective, approximately 87 to 97% of the time. So there's no question that there are thousands of sites all over the country, including many in New England that are where we're currently killing beavers and could be living with them instead. I'll add too. That there's been some great research on Skip's beaver deceivers in Virginia, which found approximately for every dollar you spend on beaver deceivers, you're saving around $8 in avoided trapping and road maintenance costs, right? Instead of having to hire a trapper year after year after year to kill beavers in all your culverts, you put in one of these devices and it's more or less set it and forget it. Another neat beaver sort of coexistence or restoration technique that I think is worth highlighting because it's really become so popular all over the West, especially, but you do see folks doing this in states like Maryland as well. Is beaver mimicry? The idea of building sort of our imitations of beaver dams, and basically the idea there is that those artificial beaver dams. They do some of the things that real beaver dams do. They store some water, they, capture some sediment, but the really important thing they do is they just direct beaver activity, right? Beavers are swimming along and they see, one of these human-built dams. They say, oh, this is perfect. I can just, expand on this and maintain it. And we can kind of funnel beaver activity to the places that we want to direct it. So this has become a really popular stream restoration technique. One of the problems that we face all over this country is that our streams are, really eroded. And the reason for that, in many cases, is actually beaver trapping. When you've got a healthy beaver-rich stream, all of those beaver dams are acting like speed bumps, right? They're slowing the water down and spreading the water out. And when you lose beavers, the stream just down cuts. There's nothing checking the velocity of the water. You get this really dramatic erosion, and that becomes a really hard place for a beaver to reestablish, right? If you're a beaver, you want to push water onto the floodplain. Well, here, the stream is so down cut that you can't really do that. And so I think that's an important and under discussed dynamic is that when we wiped out beavers, we actually diminished the capacity of our streams to hold beavers. And so, beaver dam analogs, this beaver mimicry technique is basically a way of rectifying that, of putting in some structures that that beavers can build off of and just enhance that beaver carrying capacity a little bit. The place that this technique was pioneered was in Oregon, about 20 years ago, where scientists built 115 of these beaver dam analogs, these artificial beaver dams. The beavers, kind of went gangbusters, built 120 dams of their own. The inundated area more than doubled, right? So just again, pushing water out onto the floodplain, filling in all of these old side channels and meanders and sloughs that had gone dry. So just expanding the amount of fish habitat, which led to more than a 50% increase in the survival of juvenile steelhead. These kind of salmon-like trout that we have in the Northwest. So that's beavers and humans collaborating to recover an endangered fish. I think that's a pretty cool story. And again, this technique of beaver dam analog construction is has become super popular all over the country. Again, increasingly including in the Northeast. And I just wanted to sort of conclude with one really powerful example again of this human beaver partnership working together to restore streams. So this is a stream not too far from where I live in Colorado. This is called Rough and Tumbling Creek, which is a pretty badass name for a stream, I think. And you might look at this stream and say, hey, this actually looks pretty healthy, right? It's this nice little sine wave. It's kind of wandering along through the valley. It's doing its thing, right? There's nothing wrong with this picture. But the Forest Service and Ecometrics, a stream restoration company, thought that they could do better. So they put in 2022, they put in around 40 of these beaver dam analogs, right? So you go from this to this, so you can see the stream's getting wider, right? There's more water in there. That's good. That's all promising. But then in 2023, the beavers themselves showed up to expand upon the dams that the humans had built. So we went from this to this to this, where every single red line is a beaver dam, and there are these giant ponds all over the floodplain. And to me, that's powerful because it just illustrates that, streams are they're so much more than we think they are. We would look at this and say, what is the stream channel? It's this little tiny thread, when in reality, the stream could be the entire valley bottom, right? That could all be wet with all of the benefits, drought mitigation, flood mitigation, water storage, fire prevention, fish habitat that come with that, right? So I love the way that beavers expand our conception of what's possible. So ultimately, I think that what that tells us is that if we're going to restore beavers to their full potential, we have to reconfigure our own historic imaginations in a lot of ways, right? When we killed hundreds of millions of beavers, I think we internalized this notion of a healthy stream being, a free-flowing, fast-moving, single thread, with gravel or cobble bottom, racing across the landscape, right? A nice place to catch a 6-inch brook trout. When in reality, so many of our systems looked like this, right? This epic beaver morass. And you might look at this stream and say, where is the stream, right? Where is the channel here? But in reality, again, the whole thing is the channel. And again, I think that we don't necessarily conceptualize this sort of landscape as fundamentally natural and beautiful. There are dead and dying trees everywhere that you can see. The bottom is super mucky. It's kind of hard to cast a fly in there if you're a fisherman, right? The willows are tangled up everywhere. But again, we know that these sorts of beaver-mediated riverscapes were historically, more rule than exception, in much of North America. So if we're going to get back to, Beavertopia, we have to think again about what sorts of landscapes we value. So to add it all up, we've got this fabulous animal, provides all of these services for us and other species, does it all for free, and best of all, doesn't need permits, right? That's really nice. So let's, as the mantra of the beaver believer goes, let's get out of the way and let the rodent do the work. Um, briefly, I'll say quickly that as Gaynor mentioned in passing, I've got this other newish book out about road ecology, which is this kind of the science of how roads and nature interact and how we manage some of those negative interactions for wildlife. So, I think any ecologically minded crowd would enjoy that book as well. But we're here to talk about beavers, and thanks again for hanging out. And I'm happy to take a few questions if there are any.
That's great, Ben. If you want me to see the rest of the participants, can you stop sharing your screen for a sec?
I can do that.
That's
Yeah.
great, and we'll get a gallery view up, and then I can see if folks have their hands up. I've got some questions in the chat here. Okay, let me go back to here. Can beaver and their dams coexist with healthy trout and fish habitat?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I certainly think the answer is yes, and I'm a pretty avid angler, and to me, the research shows very clearly that that beavers and fish are co-adapted. That beaver ponds dramatically increase fish production. I'll say that a couple of the other objections that you hear around beavers and trout sometimes is that beavers allegedly warm the water up, right? Trout like cold flows, and aren't beavers spreading water out, and therefore it's getting warmer. But in fact, the opposite is happening, right? Because again, beavers encourage groundwater storage. That what beavers really encourage is the exchange of groundwater and surface water, right? A beaver pond forces the water into the ground. That water it goes underground, it cools off, it trickles downstream, it percolates back up through the stream bed and contributes to colder summer flows. And we see that very clearly in the data out of Oregon and elsewhere. So to me that's another kind of fallacy is that beavers are bad for cold water fish. In fact, they're the best ally that cold water salmonids have, I think.
Okay, thanks. Jessica, I noticed I skipped over your question and you'd asked about that, about trying to reconcile their need for high oxygen. Did that answer your question?
Yourself. Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Ben and Gaynor.
Thanks. Okay, I'm seeing lots of hands up, so I'm going to go to Bev at the Vermont Beaver Collective. Bev, do you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I have a statement more than a question, and it's kind of ironic because just tonight this came into play. We Vermont has a long relationship with Ben and Skip, and our road crew just sent out a statement tonight about buying a new road grader, and my remark to them was that I thought that all of the money that we have saved over the last 3 years by eliminating all the beaver conflict work helped pay for that. And they agreed with it. And I have it in writing. So, people, I just can't stress more than anything that individuals in your communities do not be afraid to stand up and do not be afraid to speak out and do not be afraid to reach out for help. It's amazing. It really is. I mean, when Ben tells you that you're going to save $8 for every $1 they spend, I think you can push it higher. I really do. And
Yeah.
I'm proof. You know,
Yeah,
5 years ago, I didn't even know what a beaver was, and look at me now.
yeah. Look at you now. For those who
That's
don't know,
great.
the
That's a great
Vermont.
story.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
will. I mean, I'll briefly say that that's a great illustration of one of the wonderful things about beavers, which is like what a local issue they are, right? That like that we can make a lot of progress on beaver management, not by going through some giant faceless, federal agency 1,000 miles away, but, by interfacing with our road crews, our town councils, our county commissions, all of these local government agencies that control how our culverts are managed, right? That again is the most important thing we can do for beavers, I think, is protecting them, in events of culvert conflict, and that's a fantastic illustration of just how that works.
Yeah, and I think like the only other thing I would add to that is I have tried very hard to build bridges with my local wildlife enforcement agencies, and their concerns are biological. Their concerns are sportsmen. They don't have the same concerns as we do when it comes to environment and other aspects. So don't get discouraged. If you go to your local wildlife agencies and you hit roadblocks and you hit, problems, take a different angle. Reach out to people like Ben and other people in your community and Skip and the Beaver Institute and other people. Don't give up because I
Yeah,
we
they
we
do
can't.
not give up. Yeah,
Yeah,
and we will, Bev, I will share resources in an email to all the participants here, organizations like the Beaver Institute and other organizations that will help people learn a little bit more about beavers.
yeah, and we're always here, Gaylor, if you need help too.
Yeah, awesome. No, you do great work. Thanks, Bev. I'm going to go to chat. I know I see Maya and Amy also have, I want to ask questions. I've got a double question here, Ben. Have the beavers moved into the Arctic? And there's second question, have beavers been as harmed as other wildlife by PFAS?
Yeah, for the second question, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not familiar with anybody
Okay.
studying beavers and PFAS. As for the first question, yes, beavers have certainly moved into the Arctic. As it's gotten warmer, the willow line has moved north, right? Willow is, the key food source
Mm.
for beavers, and they've followed, and it's pretty controversial because as beavers impound water, they're also they're melting permafrost beneath their ponds, which is releasing methane. And also lots of Alaska natives, have concerns about beavers, modifying, traditional fishing grounds. At the same time, I went up there a couple of years ago. I did a story for Audubon magazine about that exact issue, beavers in the Arctic. And one of the amazing things to see was like all of the bird habitat they're creating up there. And the moose habitat and the wolf habitat. We know that lots of species are moving north with climate change, and in some ways, I think beavers are kind of laying the groundwork, for that shift, that process. So, yeah, certainly, a fascinating conundrum, and I think that ultimately, there's not. I mean, whether it is, whether people up there view it as desirable or not, there's not much you can do about it, right? These are just, these animals are just inexorably moving north and modifying landscapes at really a mind-blowing scale up there.
Hey, Maya, do you want to ask your question? Thank you, Ben. Maya, I think you're still muted.
Me
We
now?
can, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. I have a question that's a little less about the ecological impact or the coexistence and a little more about beaver behavior, Ben.
Yeah.
Um, I read a book that spoke about how they may have adapted from being more daytime animals to nocturnal. And I just was wondering if you could comment in general about ways that this species has adapted to coexisting with humans. We're trying to adapt to living with them. What are some of the things that have been noticed about their adaptations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The hypothesis is that beavers were historically diurnal animals who became nocturnal due to human pressure, and the argument there is that beavers really don't have good eyesight, right? Like, most nocturnal animals have, fantastic night vision. Beavers don't, and so maybe they only became nocturnal in the very recent past. I don't really buy that for a couple of reasons. First, historically, biggest beaver predator would have been the wolf, largely diurnal hunter. So there's already pressure on them during the daytime. And second, I mean, how have the vast majority of beavers been killed by humans? By trapping, right? Not by shooting them, although that certainly, lots of that has happened. And traps are not selective for a nocturnal lifestyle. So I don't, so I don't totally buy that hypothesis. As for the question about how they adapt to human presence, yeah, I mean, they are, they're incredibly adaptable. They can really habituate to humans. I think so. I used to live in Northampton, and there's a place called Fitzgerald Lake that maybe some of you are familiar with, and there's a giant beaver, a giant bank lodge. It's huge. You can see it on satellite imagery from the 1950s, so it's been there a really long time. And when I lived there, we'd go visit these beavers, and guys would be standing atop the lodge to fish for bass, and the beavers would come out and work on their lodge while guys were fishing off it, right? Because again, this is just a highly, very popular, local hangout, and beavers, knew that humans weren't a threat. So, these are smart, adaptable animals, who definitely, adjust to anthropogenic pressures in various ways.
Excellent.
Thank you.
S-
Fitzgerald Lake, I lived in Northampton for a
Oh,
long
cool.
time. Thank you.
Cool. So I'm going to go to Amy, and then I'm going to come to Chris Pacone. Amy, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank
Hi.
you very much. I'm curious because I actually teach a beaver program with Mass Audubon, but one question I have never been able to answer for sure is beaver don't cut down white pine. Is it just too sticky? Do they just not like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. They definitely they I mean, not just white pine, they really avoid conifers generally. It might be the sap, it might be the taste, it might be maybe there's some kind of nutritional thing that they're not getting from it. I will say that beavers, they although they take they do take conifers. I mean, I've seen them take spruce in Minnesota. I have a friend who's a beaver biologist who he was relocating a beaver who lived in a place with a lot of Douglas fir in the Northwest. And when the beaver was eating a lot of Douglas fir, and he actually had the beaver in captivity for a couple of weeks looking for a place to relocate it to. And he tried giving the beaver aspen and willow and all the traditional beaver foods. All the beaver would eat was Douglas fir, because that was what it had grown up with. So I don't want to say that that I would never say that beavers never take something, but you're right that that they avoid pines of all kind, and whether that's a taste thing or a sap thing or a nutritional thing, I'm not totally sure.
Okay, thank you.
From Chris Pacone, are beaver dams typically transient over the long term? They eventually degrade and allow a forest to reestablish in the wet meadow, followed by recolonization by beavers. And then the trees die, creating habitats for nesting herons, etc. Or are most dams more permanent over the long term?
Yeah, no, I think Chris, described the cycle there really, really beautifully. Beaver habitats are inherently cyclic. Transitioning from deep pond to shallower marsh to wet meadow back to forest as the beavers kind of come and go, and as Chris alluded to with the herons there, sort of supporting different species as if at each different stage, which is one of the beautiful things about them. As for how permanent they are, it really depends on the local conditions and the hydrology, right? Here in the West, I would say that our dams tend to be a little bit more transient, because we have these steep mountain streams and really big pulses of snow melt in the spring, and so the dams tend to blow out. So we see dams coming and going on the order of several years, in many cases. Whereas in the Midwest, for example, much flatter landscape, stabler hydrology, dams can persist for decades to centuries. There's an amazing study I talk about in the book where there are researchers who looked at these old railroad surveys, from the 1860s, I think, in Michigan, and then they looked at contemporary aerial imagery, and all of the maybe not all of, but many of the dams and ponds that were present in the railroad survey report were visible in aerial imagery 150 years later. So these are potentially really stable features in the right circumstances.
Okay. I'm going to come to Claudia, and then Tony has a great question. Okay.
Actually, my friend Elizabeth is going to ask the question.
Okay, I'll
Okay,
ask you. So we
Elizabeth.
live in Philadelphia, and the great thing about this city is its extensive park system, and it's was set aside 2,000 acres were set aside in like 1850 for a watershed. But I have never seen beavers anywhere around there. And I know there's lots of people, but there are pretty remote areas of it, and there's beautiful streams and ponds and
And
things.
willow trees along the edge of one of the streams
So we were just curious why we don't have
have
beavers.
beavers.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly, I mean, I think, one question is like how connected are the streams in that park to streams outside of the city, right? I mean, if they can't make it into the park, because those streams are, disconnected because they have to go under a highway, let's say, that might be a reason. It's possible that, they show up occasionally and get trapped out really quickly. Unfortunately, lots of urban park managers are very beaver phobic, castor phobic compared to castor philic, as Gaynor mentioned, and so it could be that they've been there transiently and have been killed. Yeah, but I hope they show up. I mean, look, these are really urban animals, right? They'll live anywhere we let them live. There are
Oh,
beavers in the Bronx River. There are beavers in downtown Seattle. There are beavers in Copenhagen.
someone just made that
There are
fossil.
beavers in Walmart parking lots. It's there's it, I am certain that they can make a living in that park. They just have to get there, and then people have to let them stay, right?
Maybe
Okay.
we have to introduce them.
Yeah, yeah. Good luck convincing a city park manager to do that. But I would love to see that, of course.
Yeah. We have
Okay,
friends of the Wissahickon, so we'll talk to them. Thank you.
thank you. So Tony would like to know, can we domesticate beaver for pets, backyard water retainers, meat, and fur farming?
Yeah, they actually do. Well, there's a great book called Beaver Sprite,
Mm.
about a beaver sanctuary, and Dorothy, what was her last name? She ran this beaver sanctuary and had beavers, who lived in her house, and they seemed to make lovely pets. They did eat her furniture, so you gotta, or at least chew it to pieces. So you gotta worry about that. But they're affectionate animals who definitely are capable of bonding with people. As for the sort of the farming them for meat and fur, the only place that did that, as far as I know, was the Soviet Union had pretty extensive beaver farms, during the 20th century. Those were Eurasian beavers. I am not familiar with any commercial beaver farms in the U.S., and I hope it stays that way.
Okay. Um, Diane Carson?
Hi. So I run a few programs out on the river. I own a canoe business and in town. And I am curious, we run across beaver scent mounds all the time. I'm wondering if you can give a little bit of a description of how they're used and anything you can share about that, because that's always a really popular thing for us to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. So scent mounds, for the uninitiated, scent mounds are basically they're like little cairns that beavers create to mark their territory. So they'll go to the bottom of the pond or the river, take a bunch of mud or dead leaves in their paws, pile them up into a little heap, and then they'll mark them. Typically with their anal secretions. Beavers have two sets of scent glands: the castor sacs, the castoreum, and then their anal glands. And they're mostly using that anal scent secretion to mark their territories. Beavers are incredibly olfactory animals. Again, as I mentioned earlier, poor vision, but great senses of smell. And they can very easily tell related beavers from unrelated beavers. They're super territorial, and so they're just using those little scent mounds to spray that anal secretion there and mark their territory and basically tell other beavers, intruders, that hey, this is our spot, back off. A fun thing to do is to smell those scent mounds, because as some of you possibly know, and if you read the book, I touch upon this. Males and females have different scents. It's actually the only way to differentiate a male from a female beaver reliably, unless you kill them or they're nursing. The male beavers smell like motor oil, and the female beavers smell like kind of like a stinky old cheese. Very kind of like gender role. And so so I whenever I lead beaver walks, I love doing that. And when you get a fresh scent mound, even the uninitiated can instantly tell what sex most recently marked on it.
Thank you.
Excellent. I just want to make sure I haven't missed anything. So from Robert, how do we get the government to stop killing beavers? Ben mentioned there are thousands killed yearly.
Yeah, that's so the thousands killed yearly, 25,000 or so killed by the government or killed by Wildlife Services, which is a branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who kill lots of coyotes and all kinds of critters. And there have been lots of efforts to reduce the number of beavers that agency kills. Not super effective, unfortunately. It's a pretty intractable agency in all kinds of ways. The most effective effort, I would say, took place in Oregon a few years ago, where basically, they've got all of these federally endangered salmon runs, right? Salmon species. And environmental groups argued successfully that beavers create important salmon habitat, and if you're killing beavers, you are eliminating the habitat of a listed species and are therefore in violation of the Endangered Species Act. And that argument was successful in getting Wildlife Services. I'm not exactly sure what the ultimate outcome was, but basically they modified their beaver management operation in some way. So it wasn't like the greatest outcome in the world, but it was somewhat effective. But you could imagine some version of that argument being used all over the place, right? That these are really important animals, and we need to protect them. Oregon, I keep talking about Oregon, but they are literally the beaver state, right? So they've done some interesting stuff. And they just passed a law prohibiting beaver trapping on streams that are classified as degraded within public land. So basically saying, these are the streams that we want to fix. Beavers can help us fix them. Therefore, we're not going to let you kill them in those places, right? We're not saying you can't ever kill a beaver. We're just saying that, in the streams that we're trying to restore, we are going to protect them.
Okay, thank you. From Dave Armstrong, a hydrologic question. I have seen numerous times when it seems like beavers build lodges and dig canals in areas where groundwater discharges, brackets springs. Have you seen that? It would make sense. The water would be cooler in summer and freeze later in the winter, and maybe those areas are easier for beaver to dig in.
Yeah, I've observed that exact same thing, and it's a great observation. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but my assumption has always just been, there is a reliable source of water, right? And if you're a beaver, you want I mean, that's the great thing about beavers is that they can really do a lot with a very little bit of water, but you need some amount of water, right? And so especially in places here in the West where our streams are a little more ephemeral, and prone to drying up in the summer, those spots where you've got groundwater seeps and springs are really important, and just having a reliable water source.
Okay, thank you. Tony, do beaver ponds create better, bigger carbon sinks?
Yeah, they do. Again, they're capturing lots of organic matter and just entraining that organic matter and sediment at the pond bottom. There's the problem is that if you kill the beavers and the pond drains, then organic matter can decompose and it becomes a carbon source. So in some ways, it's, I think it's an argument to leave the beavers alone, right? That an active functioning beaver pond is a carbon sink, and an inactive one is potentially a carbon source. So let's not kill the beavers.
Okay. By the way, I should say, Ben, lots and lots and lots of things in the chat about how much people have enjoyed your presentation and how much they love your books. So lots of comments there.
Good.
I know there was from Susan Akers. We have 2 lodges on our small lake in northwest New Jersey. A group of us convinced them not to trap, but well done. But my question is, are beavers troubled by people walking on top of or around their lodges? I'm wondering if we should fence off the areas on the lake shore to ease any angst for the beavers.
Yeah, I think it's fine. The lodge is pretty secure. These are animals who are accustomed to having wolves and bears and all kinds of animals, sniffing around their lodges, and so I don't have much concern about people walking around a beaver lodge during the day. The thing that would concern me potentially is if there's lots of dog use in that area. Beaver dog conflicts are an issue. Either party can get killed. Dogs do get killed by beavers, and vice versa. So, maybe some kind of signage about keeping your dog on leash and not letting it swim in the pond right there. I'd be more concerned about the dogs than the people.
Okay. I think there is one from Christine. She says she's a huge fan of your books. Crossings was her ultimate favorite, but also loved Eager. I was curious, was his time living in MA his inspiration for writing Eager? He writes quite a bit about MA and New England, particularly Westford, if I seem to recall. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I've had great experiences with beavers all over the country, but certainly, living in Massachusetts was wonderful because I got to hang out a lot with Mike Callahan. Mike is he lives in Southampton, and he's again, he's the founder of the Beaver Institute, and before that, he ran a company, solving beaver problems, lots of contracts with Mass DOT, around the state. One of the great beaver heroes out there, and also just a really lovely, personable guy who's a lot of fun to be with. So, the chance to live in Northampton, not far at all from Mike, and spend a bunch of time in the field with him, and go visit Skip in Vermont as well. A couple of great New England beaver champions who really informed this book.
Oh, that's wonderful. Ben, thank you so much for your time this evening. I really appreciate it. There's so many comments in here saying how much they enjoyed it. One great one just said, Eager changed my attitude towards beavers. Thank
Awesome.
you. And what better thing could you hope for?
Thank you, Gaynor, so much for having me. Thanks to all of you for being here.